Good afternoon, Rochester. Welcome to the Equity Alliance Equity Series. My name is Wafal Khalifa, and I work for Destination Medical Center as the Equitable Development Coordinator. I'm here with my colleague, Chow Metala, and she serves City of Rochester as the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director. We welcome you to the May episode as we have an awesome presenter and speaker today who would provide to us some very valuable information on the Asian and Pacific Islander communities in our state of Minnesota. And before we introduce our speaker for today, I would like to just remind everyone of where you could find the past episodes. You will find them in the Destination Medical Center YouTube channel. And we started this series, as some of you may remember, back in July of 2023. So we have a good amount of episodes with really awesome topics and information. Feel free to utilize them as an educational resource for you and your organization to provide more information about how can we improve our organizations internally and make equitable changes. And if you and your organization are interested in joining our Equity Alliance, feel free to contact me or Chow Metala, and this is our contact information. The Equity Alliance is open for all the organizations in Rochester, and we welcome having conversations and share with you what some of the actions that we have taken so far within City of Rochester and DMC in order to adapt to some of the goals of the Equity Alliance. Now, for today's episode, as I've mentioned earlier, the topic of our episode today is working toward equality for Minnesotans of Asian and Pacific Islander heritage. And I would like to welcome Sia Her. Sia is the Executive Director for the Minnesota Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans. Before joining the council, Sia served as an education and training department manager at the Hmong American Partnership and as a campaign manager for the successful St. Paul Public Schools, Strong Communities. We hope that everyone utilizes our chat function today and plug in your questions, comments, and as I pass the mic to Sia, feel free to type your name in the chat and which organization you're associated with. Welcome, Sia, to the Rochester Equity Alliance Equity Series. Thank you for being with us today.
Yay. Thank you, Wafa, for that introduction. It's my honor to be here with all of you. I'm sitting in my home office, so I'm not necessarily missing out on the beautiful weather outside. Also, I'm just especially excited to be here because I see some very familiar faces that have become near and dear to me in the 12 years I have served as executive director at the council. So Al and Kim, and others on the call who've been incredibly supportive of the council long before I came. Thank you. Wonderful to see your lovely faces today. And to those of you who may not yet know me, I hope that this is the beginning of a more active relationship between our office and your respective offices. So again, my name is Sia Her. I am by ancestry Hmong. I am a member of Minnesota's largest API community, estimated at about 95,000 strong, according to the latest available U.S. Census data tracks. I came on board as executive director in March of 2013, which feels like a lifetime ago. And that feeling is especially poignant at a time like this in the year when we are nearing the end of the annual legislative session. And I'm just, to be blunt, I'm just sick and tired of politicians and what's happening over at the Capitol. So the council is approaching its 40th anniversary. It was created in 1985 at a time when the state's API population was about 1%. And today, we are a little bit under 7% of the state's total population. We are arguably the most diverse racial community in the state of Minnesota. The council, let's see, I actually have a PowerPoint presentation, and
I was just gonna
I
remind you of
completely
that.
forgot about it.
No, no, it's
So,
totally fine.
So my PowerPoint presentation reminds me that I'm here with all of you for several reasons. Perhaps the most important one is that the month of May is API Heritage Month. This month, I don't want to assume that you all know, but I also don't want to assume that you don't know. So I'll just say that API Heritage Month is now a month-long celebration across the country, and it's because in 1992 Congress passed legislation to make this the case. The month of May was chosen to commemorate the arrival of the first Japanese immigrants to the United States, and that would be May 7th, 1843, and then to remember the contributions of the Chinese in the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad on May 10th, 1869. So just a simple overview of why the month of May was designated as API Heritage Month. During this time of the month across the country, including here in the state of Minnesota, we see all sorts of community events, from the corporate to the nonprofit to government offices. There are performances and there are opportunities very much like this one to help build greater mutual understanding, mutual respect, and therefore, I think, I believe, a keener sense of shared identity and shared destiny. And so, for me, every year I'm asked to give a number of presentations, and I do so based on the premise that these opportunities for us to engage in dialogue about the state of Asian Pacific Minnesotans within the context of API Heritage Month, these conversations are not just to give you a bunch of information, but to help, to inspire questions that you may not necessarily feel comfortable asking in a different place and a different time. And so I hope that you will you will have some questions for me at the end of my time, at the end of my presentation. I mentioned earlier that the council was created in 1985. Since then, the council has gone through several iterations of change. And what I mean by that is that what we call the enabling statute, which is the state law that lays out the statutory role and responsibilities and the authority of the council. So in state government, we call it the state statute that gives the council its legal authority. In 2015, the three ethnic councils were restructured. And so the Asian Pacific Council, my agency, the African Heritage Council, and the Latino Affairs Council were restructured. And so now they're all under the same state law. And we'll call it Minnesota Statute Section 15.0145, or we'll say the Ethnic Council's Enabling Statute. It's a relatively long section of law, I think, but it can be summed up into this slide in front of you. The ethnic councils wear several hats. They are the chief advisor to the lawmaking body of state government, which is the legislature, and then the governor. So in the act of advising lawmakers and the governor on policy and administrative practices, we are asked to do so in such a way that we advance the well-being of the different communities under our respective umbrella. And we are asked to do our advisory and advocacy work, not just in a way where you constantly see me at the table with the leaders of the policy issue at hand or the State Department in question, but we bring community leaders to that table physically, if possible. If not, we bring information that allows for a greater sense of connection between legislators and the people that they serve of API ancestry, the governor and the API Minnesotans, or the commissioners who are the governor's cabinet members who are responsible for like the Department of Human Rights or Human Services. So much of our work at the council is about helping to educate different levels of government, whether it's municipal or state or even federal, about who makes up Asian Pacific Minnesota and where are these groups of people from. And it's not just about like me saying, well, the Cambodians are from Cambodia, but it is really up to the council to communicate to the state of Minnesota about the circumstances that prompted the exodus of Cambodian ancestry immigrants into the United States, and particularly into the state of Minnesota, because oftentimes in telling that story, we are then positioned to advise legislators and the governor as to why this particular group of people behave the way that it does. For example, why it doesn't, why it's not actively engaging with government. And very quickly, for our Cambodian American community in the state of Minnesota, it's not as actively engaged with government because many of you may already know that the Khmer Rouge was possibly the worst genocide in human history. Millions of Cambodians were slaughtered and buried in unmarked graves because of the color of their skin or the nature of their professional practice at the time of the Khmer Rouge from 1975 to 1979. So in statute, the council is the advisor, the advocate, and the bridge builder between different groups of Minnesotans, but in particular state government and the different communities that are identified as API ancestry. Also in our enabling statute, section 15.0145, the provisions pertaining to our office specifically calls out who these communities are. And so the language is all countries east of and including Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so if you can imagine a map of the world and you start with Afghanistan and Pakistan and you move east, you wrap around, Southeast Asia, East Asia. Countries that typically come to mind are, like China and Japan and North Korea and South Korea. But what you might not know or might never really get to thinking is that we also have, under the API umbrella, groups from the Micronesian islands. We also, cover the Pacific Islands, obviously. And so we are an incredibly diverse community. We often say that we represent a community of Americans descended from more than 60 plus nations. But that doesn't even begin to get at the complicated and complex communities that we serve. Because in a country like Laos, for example, that country is made up of lots and lots of ethnic groups. And so in the state of Minnesota, we have the Hmong ancestry group, we have the Lao ancestry, the Lao ethnic group. In a country from the country of Burma, we have the Burmese ethnic group, and then we have the Karen and the Karenni. And Minnesota is home to the largest concentration of Hmong Americans in the country and home to one of the top 3 largest Karen communities in the country. Both of these are refugee experience communities. And I'll go into more details about the distinction between refugees and immigrants, not because I don't believe that you all know it already, but for the work of the council, it's important for us to stress the differences between these two groups because those differences have a direct impact on how we advise legislators and the governor, how we bring these communities to bear upon the questions or the work that's being done in that moment, and whether we choose to bring them to the table in person or we assist them by submitting letters, or engaging through other more passive approaches because of their different levels of comfort with government. The pie chart in front of you depicts the 10 largest API communities. What's really interesting is that the Hmong community is the largest. It's a refugee community. And then our second largest community is the Asian Indian. And that is what we call an immigrant community. So immigrants come to the United States searching for economic and educational opportunities, whereas refugees move into the United States and other countries around the world, because remaining in their native country means that they could very well be, killed. Right. And so these two large communities, or even if we move into including our Chinese community, the Chinese and the Asian Indian communities are immigrant communities. And so when you juxtapose these three largest communities together and you think about their developing American profile, and you look at what that means in terms of their political behaviors, specifically their partisan behaviors, it makes for a very difficult, it's a beautiful community, don't get me wrong. I just love the diversity of our communities, and everything from the clothes to the food is just exquisite. But the work of the council, as it is written in law, when we are looking at how diverse our communities are and the circumstances that brought them into the United States, our work is beyond difficult. I can't, in my 13th year as executive director, I still I don't feel comfortable with my ability yet to communicate to stakeholders just how incredibly difficult it is for me to serve as executive director and for the council to just continue to be the Council on Asian Pacific Minnesotans, because it is straddling so many groups by race, by ethnicity. And then when you think about gender orientation, sexual orientation, when you think about economic socioeconomic status, when you think about generational differences, when you think about communities that have been here for so long, such as the Filipino versus a community that just arrived, such as our Afghan evacuees community in 2020. Just again, I would be remiss if I didn't say again and again that the work of our agency is so incredibly difficult, and no one else in government, even the body that created us, which is the legislature, there is no way that at any given moment in time, any single one legislator can possibly understand the weight of the responsibility that's been assigned to us as a state agency. So altogether, the 2020 census has an API community at about 370,000 strong. We reside in every single one of Minnesota's 87 counties. About 85% of us are concentrated in the 7-county metro area. We have communities that live as far north as Baudette and Warroad, and that would be our Lao community in Warroad, our Filipina community in Baudette. In Warroad and Baudette, these communities work at companies like Polaris. In southern Minnesota, we have good-sized concentrations of the Hmong community in Marshall, Walnut Grove, and Tracy. And then in Rochester, we have our Filipino, our Chinese, our Asian Indian communities. And then we have some of our, refugee communities, the Vietnamese and the Cambodians, to be specific. And so we are spread out across the state. In the last 20 years, we have seen, growth, and we've seen ups and downs in the population growth in greater Minnesota, because communities like the Cambodian have matured, and as children have moved away because they've climbed the socioeconomic ladder. We also have, new communities moving into greater Minnesota, such as the Karen. So what's really interesting about the Karen is that about 80 to 85% of them reside within the Twin Cities. But about 13% of them reside in greater Minnesota. And you might ask yourself, why is that, right? It's because of companies like, Jenny O and other meat packaging companies. These are employment opportunities that don't require these refugees to be fluent in English or to have to have a high school degree or another educational degree higher than that. And so people go where economic opportunities are. That doesn't mean that they go they move out to greater Minnesota and live permanently out there. Sometimes they will stay out there Monday through Friday, and then they'll come home to their community during the weekend. When we look at data points on our communities, we always anticipate a healthy margin of error because of language barriers, but also because some of these more vulnerable communities are very mobile. In greater Minnesota, while some meat packaging company opportunities may be available, there isn't yet as great of a sense of community. So meaning that there are fewer grocery stores, there are fewer opportunities for cultural performances. And so community members will move out to greater Minnesota and hold an employment opportunity out there, but then they'll still continue to come back to the Twin Cities for their cultural experiences and for food and for family relations. So depending on what time of the year you're looking at, the council's work changes. In that during the months of January and January through typically the end of May, we have our eyes trained on what's happening over at the Capitol, because this is the time during the year when the Constitution calls back Minnesota's legislators to revisit, existing state laws, and to look at like this year, this is not a budget year, but next year will be a budget year. And so when legislators come back next year, they'll be putting together the state's biennial budget. So during these 5 to 6 months, our eyes are trained on the legislature and their work at the Capitol, because we are the chief advisor to that lawmaking body and to the governor. And so every biennium, the way that we go about making sure that we are well positioned to advise and advocate is we deploy what's called a community priority survey. And this is a survey that's done online, and then we attend as many community events as possible, and we deploy these surveys in person with the understanding that the communities we're trying to get to in person are the communities for whom completing a survey online might be a relatively unknown activity for them. Or they don't read and write in English. And so we engage with them to complete the survey. And then others, who are more familiar with this method of communication, complete the survey online. We will usually open the survey for a period of several months. We'll close it. My research director will then analyze and synthesize the input submitted by members of the community. And so for the current legislative session, the current slide in front of you indicates that our legislative agenda for this current biennium was informed by about 323 respondents. These are people who self-identify as individuals with ancestry in the Asian and Pacific Islander nations. And so, we ask them in that survey to identify their profession and their ethnic ancestry group and several other variables. But most importantly, what the survey does is it asks them to help identify for us, what are the issues of the day for them? If they are going to maximize their chances at achieving their hopes and dreams, what are the issues that we have to address on their behalf or with them in state government, whether it's during the legislative session or in our day-to-day work with the governor's executive branch agencies. And so the slide in front of you identifies what those policy areas are for the 320 something respondents. That's actually a relatively small universe of responses, but that's because in the last couple of years, coming out of COVID, there have been certain challenges related with our ability to get out there and to intensively conduct outreach for the purpose of increasing the number of respondents to this survey. So this next slide identifies, it's just another version of the previous slide, but what it does is it has that red box over the top 5 areas. These are the most frequently cited areas or policy issues of importance to those 323 respondents. And so you'll see that mental health and or substance abuse came out as the top priority. Higher education, access to higher education is the number 2 issue, and then equity and the achievement gap, and then access to health care. My research director will run some numbers, and then what we'll do is we'll bring the findings to the board for a discussion, and then the board ratifies our legislative agenda. And so in the slide in front of you, this is what we mean. The board will ask us, well, what do community members mean when they say access to healthcare? And so what you have in front of you is a slide depicting the themes that came out of their responses. And then we supplied the board members with specific quotes from specific responses that were provided by the respondents, so that board members are not, are not confused about what community members may mean when they, or what they're saying when they say access to healthcare as a policy priority that they would like us to take on, right? So in a nutshell, or in for the current legislative session, what you see in front of you is our legislative agenda. We'll we'll track and we'll either argue against or for specific pieces of legislative proposals in the areas that have been identified as the top 5 areas. We are actually a relatively small state agency. When we are fully staffed, we have 5 FTEs, and then we have a team of contractors that have been with us for more than a decade. And then our human services, human resource services and financial management are all services provided by the Department of Admin, Minnesota Management and Budget. And so because we are a relatively small team, this is actually a pretty ambitious legislative agenda. So our enabling statute also gives us the authority to work with legislators to draft legislative proposals, and then to work with the legislature to pass those bills into law. And so during my tenure, domestic violence, so gender-based violence, has been a top priority for us, which is why in that second half of the slide in front of you, you see that increased understanding of violence against Minnesota's Asian Pacific women and children remains an ongoing position of the council. During my tenure as executive director, we've helped the state to understand the nature, the scope, and the prevalence of violence against Asian women and girls. Because the existing data points on violence against this particular group of victims/survivors indicates that while 1 in 3 women across the country reported having experienced one form or another of gender-based violence, for the API community, it's 1 in 2 women. Right? And so that number alone has been concerning to community leaders for a long time. In many of our communities, the reason why this data point and others are so alarming is because most of our communities are quite patriarchal. Many of them are quite new to the United States. And so, existing federal and state laws protecting minors from sexual assault, sexual abuse, or laws protecting victims of domestic violence are not necessarily well understood and in many cases respected by many in these communities. And so while it can be a pretty scary ask from the perspective of legislators to take on this issue because it might alienate a strong universe of voters inside the different API communities, it is also critically important for legislators to take on an issue such as this because for too long we have counted on women and young girls and children to stand up to their abusers. And that has not been as effective of an approach. And so when I came on board in 2013, the nonprofit leaders asked that the council introduces itself as a state agency and take on this issue, and therefore distract or move some of the attention that are focused on the women and the girls to a state agency. Because for so long, advocates of domestic violence victims have also been, have also put their lives at risk while trying to help victims and survivors move away from their dangerous situations. And so I've been incredibly proud to help lead the council's work on domestic violence. We've, in the last 10 years, we've helped the state to move several pieces, one of which created the statewide domestic violence and sexual assault prevention program housed within the Department of Health. That's a pilot program, but it took a lot of energy and resources on our end in order to get the state of Minnesota to even create that pilot project, which then put Minnesota on the map as one of the half a dozen or so states across the country with statewide prevention programs. All of you, I think what would be helpful is for me to also talk about some of the lessons we've learned in our work at the council, particularly as it relates to how to compel members of our community to move into spaces and to engage in ways that they traditionally or otherwise would not. So the slide in front of us is just a really simple one on some lessons learned. I tell legislators and the governor and others at various levels of government that one should never, ever, ever underestimate the power of being present in communities. What I mean by that is that even if you show up at the Chinese Lunar New Year celebration in Rochester, even if you go to Asian Mall and you spend an afternoon there eating and just observing members of the community interacting, you may not necessarily think that anyone is observing you and noticing that you're there, but they do. Anytime there are new faces inside these community spaces, community members notice. And so if you are a member of management and leadership within your organization, it's important to be present in communities because the advocacy of your work is a direct result of perceived trust in you. And so oftentimes it doesn't take that much for people to begin asking, why is this individual here all the time? Or why is this individual here for so long? And so take advantage of every opportunity to be inside communities. When you are inside communities, if you are in communities long enough and frequently enough, the language barriers that you may experience because you don't speak say you don't speak Hmong or you don't speak Chinese. Over a long period of time, I actually believe that you can still learn so much about that community that you're in, regardless of the cultural and the linguistic differences, right? You start to observe certain ways, certain mannerisms. You start asking questions and people start telling you more than you expect because increasingly they're comfortable with you. And so take every opportunity to be inside communities. When you are inside communities, I would say the most important piece of advice I could give you is if it's a really important event, like say, for example, a New Year's celebration with a formal program, and you're showing up and the community leaders know that you're there, it's really important that you understand and you accept the definition of an appropriate amount of time to be there, right? So what that means is that don't show up for a really important event, at 12 o'clock and then leave at 12:30. That's sometimes just enough for you to do damage to the relationship that you're trying to build or the relationship that's been built by others before you, and you're just the latest representative of your office, right? When you show up at important events and you don't understand the significance of those events, you don't have, community leaders who are your cultural brokers in that space and that time, and then you decide that you only have 30 minutes to be there. People are going to notice when you leave. And so if you're going to show up at community events, be very intentional about why you're showing up, try to get as much information as you can. One of the most important pieces, of information is how long do I need to stay in order to, in order to deliver this message that this event and this community matter to me, right? So, next lesson learned is just really learning where people have been. I have already mentioned the importance of being present in communities. I tell legislators more often than any other group of stakeholders that it is not enough for you to read a book or two or five about a group of people and why they're in the United States or why they reside in your district. You actually do have to sit down with members of that community and hear from their own mouths what their individual stories are, because it is in that exchange that you really get to see the humanity in the other person. And you get to really hear about their hopes and dreams in words that they recognize, right? And so take the time to sit down with people and really listen to their stories. Understand why an Asian mother is cursing her child. And what I mean by that is she's not just cursing her child. It's when she is cursing a child, it is her love cloaked in fear. She's afraid that her child might walk a path in life that is very similar to the one she has walked all her life. And that has been a road where others haven't recognized the dignity in her or her humanity. Other Americans might think that she is here in the United States because she's attracted to the possibility of a welfare check, when in fact what happened was that she was the victim of a genocide, and she was one of the few lucky ones who survived not only the genocide but the crossing of transcontinental boundaries. And then she came to the United States and worked in a job she worked in an assembly line where her supervisor yelled at her day in and day out, but she stayed in that job because she understood that only when she can pay for a roof over the head of her children and food on the table in a consistent manner will those children be able to go to school, learn what they need to learn, and become the people that she has always dreamed of. And so really learn where people have been beyond just reading books about them. It's a really heavy investment that I'm asking you and others to do, but it is what has to be done as Minnesota becomes increasingly diverse. The other lesson we've learned quite well is that you can hold people accountable. We can all hold each other accountable, regardless of the language, the cultural differences. It's really important in all of our work to take the time to explain again and again to the targeted audiences, whether they're individuals or a large community, what it is we're about. Because it's not that they don't want to do what we're asking them to do, it's that the circumstances of their lives oftentimes do not allow them the luxury of delivering on what we're asking them to do. And so, continue to educate them, continue to ask questions, continue to be present, but do so in a way that is genuinely respectful of them, regardless of linguistic and cultural differences. When there is respect present in a relationship, that is a universal language. And so that's what I give you during the month of API Heritage. I'm also presenting to groups that are entirely Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And the other message that I then give to an audience with that, shared identity is this message that we don't just need to educate non-Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders about who makes up Asian Pacific Minnesota. It is oftentimes the case that we need to continue to do even more intensive educational campaigns inside Minnesota's API communities, because most communities only know about themselves. They don't know, for example, members of my Hmong community don't know much about the Afghan evacuees. And even right now, in the year 2024, on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the Vietnam War, there are still longstanding tension between segments of the Lao, the Hmong, the Vietnamese, and the Cambodian communities because of historical experiences, but also because we still have so much to learn about each other. And in our daily lives in America, while we're chasing our own American dreams, we haven't really had the luxury to really sit down and not only hear the other stories, but see their tears and feel the pain of the journey that they've had to make. And so, API Heritage Month is an opportunity for all of us to build bridges to one another, not because we're feeling sorry for each other, but because we understand that as Americans, as Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, as communities of color, that at some point in time, our individual fates intertwine, and we then actually have a shared fate. And so it is in recognition of that shared destiny, shared fate, that we also have to understand one another so that we can understand where there are opportunities for a shared political agenda or social agenda. And so I recognize that we're about 17 minutes away from 1 o'clock. I should just stop there and see if the most courageous among you have immediate questions that I can help to answer.
Thank you so much, Sia. This was a great presentation. I appreciate you sharing all this information. And one thing that we always, Chow and I, talk about is recognizing that diversity and our differences, it's a place of benefit, not a deficit, and how beneficial it is to be diverse in our economy, in our education, in our community. And it's a great opportunity to recognize our Asian Pacific Islander communities in Minnesota and learn more. We welcome all the questions, comments in the chat. I see a question. I see a question from Al. Let me read it here. Okay. As diverse a group, AAPI is with different ethnic, political, and economic differences. Is there a set of common concerns or characteristics, let me see here, that is generally shared by the APPI community?
You were cut out for a nanosecond there, Wafa, so but I think I caught the majority of Al's question. I think the issue that comes to mind immediately is Asian hate. During COVID, some the Asian hate was understood as acts that would be committed against Asian Americans of Chinese ancestry, right? But that wasn't what happened. Anybody who looked like Chinese could be on the receiving end of hateful language or even acts of violence, right? And so that, is the clearest example of an issue that for once in my life, during my tenure as executive director, I had no qualms about saying to the governor and to anybody who would listen to me, the number one issue at the forefront of every Asian American and Pacific Islanders' mind is Asian hate. We have disagreed passionately on data disaggregation. We have disagreed passionately on the amount of funding to be given to our E through 12 public schools, right? We have agreed to disagree vehemently on so many issues, but on Asian hate, we all came together. Groups that I have seen during my tenure, like be on the complete end of the spectrum relative to others, they came together because they understood then that whether they were Chinese or Japanese or Hmong, that the Americans who would cause them harm do not know that and cannot tell them apart. And if they're at the wrong place at the wrong time, or even if they're at the right place at the right time, they could be out grocery shopping at Costco and find themselves physically assaulted. And so that's an issue. And I hate to talk about that issue, but there is a silver lining there. And it's that right before COVID and Asian hate was data disaggregation, and that issue split several large segments of our community. Really, that issue helped to highlight this, the rift that exists between those who have wealth and those who don't, right? And then Asian hate brought all of us together because we understood better than ever what it means to have a shared political identity. And therefore, when a threat is levied against us, we all have, we're in that camp together, and it doesn't matter if we're Chinese or Hmong or Vietnamese. So that's an immediate response.
Thank you, Sia. I also received a question regarding the community survey. How often does the council complete or send out that survey?
That is designed to align with the legislative calendar, and so every biennium. So this summer, we will deploy the survey again so that we analyze and synthesize and have a legislative agenda ready to be proposed to the board by the end of this calendar year. So that next session, which is a budget year, which is the first year of the 2-year schedule, we will have a slightly different legislative agenda depending on how large the sample size is, who participates in the survey. So this summer into the fall is when we expect to deploy the next survey.
Great. We received also a question here. I am curious, with so many different ethnic groups from diverse backgrounds and cultural and social experiences, is there a sense of scarcity when it comes to access to resources and essential needs like access to decent and affordable healthcare, housing, etc.? You spoke it a bit, but how can we in Minnesota foster greater collaboration between groups within the AAPI community and promote a spirit of shared community versus a sense of competition?
Mm-hmm. What a phenomenal question. I don't mean to oversimplify the premise for the question that was just asked, but my immediate reaction is you and we together, we can all foster greater collaboration between these different communities, whether it's the API communities or the African ancestry communities or the Latin communities. We can do so by not, first and foremost, by not giving into the demands of politicians. Um, our partisan politics are so divisive these days. And because of the environment within which my agency is housed, and because of the nature of our statutory role and responsibilities, I oftentimes think about the greatest threats to camaraderie and solidarity between our different communities, right? And whether I'm sitting in front of the governor and or the state government finance committee in the House or the Senate, I would say politicians, we as community leaders, as community members, we need to not agree with politicians when they make decisions based on what they think is going to garner them the greatest number of votes from certain communities. That is one of the most simple and yet critically important strategies we can deploy if our goal is to foster greater collaboration. Because when groups start to say, hey, I'm a part of this large community, I should get what I want, right? Like, for example, what Hmong Minnesota wants is good enough for Asian Pacific Minnesota, right? Like, yeah, that might benefit members of the Hmong community, but I kid you not, members of the Filipino Minnesota community are not going to be happy with that, right? And so, if we just go with what many of our elected officials do and say, particularly around important election years like 2024, we contribute to the ongoing schisms, if not outright tension between different groups, because of the perception of the number of their votes and their collective ability to influence a statewide or even a district-wide race. And so that's one. Two, I think just really going out of our way to be in spaces where we might not be, right? And so maybe another way to say that is learning to become comfortable in uncomfortable spaces, because we absolutely have to be in communities' territories in order to begin to see the world from their vantage point of view. We have to be inside communities so that we can understand when a mother is chastising a child, it's not that she just wants to chastise the child. It's because maybe our education policies are, impacting them in such a way that the child not succeeding is causing the parent great anxiety, right, about the future. And so that's why the mother is chastising and perhaps even using words that you and I might in mainstream America identify as abusive language. But in her mind, it's her act of love toward that child, right? And so being in communities so that you're not constantly waiting for the people who need you to come and find you, right? You're in their spaces so that in their time of need, you can read all of the messages that are being communicated without someone saying to you verbatim, I need help, right? Oftentimes, when someone says that to us, it's too late.
Thank you. I just want to remind everyone that we still welcome your questions, or if you would like to unmute your microphone. Oh, go ahead, Al. Welcome.
Another similarity is from within the AAPI diversity is there's a tendency for outside group to say that AAPI group is doing good enough, well enough.
Mm-hmm.
The whole idea about being model minority
Mm-hmm.
and we shouldn't really necessarily need to worry about them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's actually the data would suggest that if we aggregate it, you'll find that there's tremendous problem there. So how do you advocate that position about don't lump everybody together and say the AAPI group is doing well, which is a general perception, right?
Yeah, that's a great question, Al. In my capacity as executive director, I often frame it as, the diversity in our community has its pros and cons, right? And so, while our diversity is beautiful in so many ways, our diversity also means that we can clash on policy issues. And so, on the issue of data disaggregation, which is what you're getting at. For example, in education, in the E through 12 system, when we ask for the disaggregation of data, we're asking for the breakdown of the Asian category so that we can see how the Hmong students are doing, how the Vietnamese, how the Asian Indians are doing. Because of the size of each of these communities, when you lump like the Hmong, the Chinese, the Vietnamese, the Cambodians, the Filipinos together, the fact that the Chinese and the Asian Indian and the Filipinos and, are relatively large communities too, at the aggregate level, you may see that Asian students are performing really well on their, math or reading standards tests. But when you disaggregate the data and you look at it, particularly when you look at the refugee experience, the students out of the refugee experience communities, you'll see that there are great discrepancies between their performances on these standardized tests. And that's why data disaggregation is so important. I think increasingly, we have come a long way just in the last 5 to 7 years in our API community's collective understanding of the benefits of data disaggregation, because we have given ourselves ample opportunities to talk about why we're fearful of disaggregated data or why we see the potential in it. And so I absolutely believe that the segments of our community who were once vehemently opposed to data disaggregation have become much more comfortable with data disaggregation today than they were, say, 5 years ago, because they have come to understand that while data disaggregation might not directly positively impact them, that when the most vulnerable amongst us do better, we all do better as a community. And so, yeah. That's my response for now.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Al, for that question. Maybe we'll take a part of Sadie's question. How do you report back to communities that participate in the survey?
Sure. We are by law required to submit an annual report to the legislature by January 15th of every year. And so that last provision within our enabling statute says that we must report on our strategic plan goals. And so we try to put together an annual report that allows for community members reading at the 9th or 10th grade level, an overview of the work we've done on legislative during the legislative session. So we'll identify in that report specific bills that we worked on, given our legislative agenda. So we've been one of the premier champions of the Teachers of Color Act. For many years now, we've been one of the chief champions of the medical interpreting bill that is intended to change how the Department of Health, supports and holds accountable medical interpreters in the state of Minnesota, right? So we've worked on issues like this. And so our annual report is first and foremost the number one way we go about reporting back to the community about our work. I spend the bulk of my time inside the various communities. So I'm not very active on social media because that's not my preferred way of communicating. But it's always the case that between Thursday night and Sunday, I'm in back-to-back community events. And so I am not just preaching to everyone about the importance of being inside communities. I actually embody that principle or that value exceptionally well based on my calendar. And everyone can see on my calendar where I am from what time to what time. And so it's in those one-on-one conversations that I am, as executive director, reporting back to community leaders directly the work that we have done that benefits them specifically. Sometimes that conversation is not appropriate for an annual report, or it's not appropriate for a community forum, because to someone's question earlier about this zero-sum game mentality, right? In the state of Minnesota and across this country, there seems to be, an effort to a competition about who's the most oppressed, suppressed, repressed, right group. And so when we talk about the work that we've done for one community, even though that should be perceived by other communities as great, that's addressing the most vulnerable amongst us. Some groups, some leaders might feel like, well, that community is getting more than what my community is getting, right? And then that serves, that in that case, are reporting back to community leaders rather than helping to strengthen our ties to one another. It actually contributes to the further fragmentation of the bridges, the monkey bridges, I call them, that are in place. And for those of you who may not necessarily be familiar with monkey bridges, what you see on this slide is an example of a monkey bridge, right? And I often say the work that all of us do, whether it's in government, the nonprofit sector, or whatnot, we're not always going to be able to build the most the strongest bridges, right, to one another. But monkey bridges are just fine when they're better than no bridges whatsoever, right? You just have to be very careful as you're crossing a monkey bridge, and you just have to understand that it's still very fragile. But a fragile bridge is better than no bridge whatsoever. So.
Thank you so much, Sia. Thank you so much for answering all these questions. And for others who we did not get to answer your question today, feel free to send us an email. We will also send a follow-up email with the link to the YouTube channel with today's episode, along with the presentation that was shared today. Thank you so much for being with us, and please take the time to recognize and celebrate the Asian and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And I think we welcome a follow-up conversation with you again, Sia, because I think our community would definitely benefit from hearing more about the council work and how we could utilize some of these resources and reports within our community. So thank you so much. And I just want to briefly share with all of you that our next episode is going to be June 12th at noon. And then between now until June, we are hosting a community co-design graduation celebration for our third cohort of facilitators. It's going to be next week on the 15th from 7 to 8 p.m. And I will also add the Eventbrite link in the email. Everyone is welcome to come and join us to celebrate our next cohort of facilitators. In the meantime, I hope everyone enjoys the spring month, the May month, and we hope to see you next month with a new topic, new episode. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to be here with you. I hope you were able to take away some useful information. Please don't be a stranger to us. Wafa, you're welcome to share my contact information. I'm mostly kidding, but I'm not kidding when I say if you text me or call me, the only time I won't respond to you is between 12 midnight and 6 in the morning. Otherwise, I'm available. So
thank you. Thank you so much,
you're
Sia.
welcome.
Thank you.